Welcome to our Leaders in Housing Counseling call. Glad to have you here. We have a pretty full crowd of topics to deal with today on the major housing legislation that Senator Elizabeth Warren has introduced, and we have a really strong panel we'll introduce in a couple minutes. So I think this should be an excellent discussion. Please feel free, if you've got thoughts or questions, to put them in the question box, and Matthew will do his good work in asking them at the right moment. Well, we're going to start out with funding update, and we'll talk about the legislation, the opportunities, the challenges it represents, but I think more the opportunities for us. And then we'll do a quick plug on joining NHRC. And I have to say, as I think I've mentioned earlier, we've had a very good year of new memberships as well as renewals, so really appreciate the support. So with that note, let's quickly jump in on federal funding.
Great. So just a couple things to quickly go over. So for the current year, so FY 2019, just wanted to mention to folks that that last week, I guess it was, the president signed the second minibus, it was 2 spending bills, and it also included a continuing resolution for the remaining bills that they didn't pass spending bills for. So that includes the THUD bill. So the bottom line for housing counseling funding for FY 2019 is that it's a continuing resolution through December 7th, so that just keeps programs level funded. So that's the fiscal year that started October 1, and the continuing resolution will run until the first week of December. So that is FY 2019. And then did also just want to mention to folks, hopefully.
Well, yeah, and just so what they will have to then pass the THUD budget amount in December. So that's the bottom line here is that we don't know what we got funded for this year.
That's correct. And it's also probably worth noting that the THUD bill, from everything that we've heard, is done. It's not, what's been holding up them from passing, a bigger spending bill. So it's very likely that the housing counseling number is already, they know what it is, but unfortunately we do not know what it is. So that is FY 2019. For FY 2020, I did just want to mention, hopefully folks have seen, we're doing one of our big pushes for a large sign-on letter. This is going to go to Secretary Carson and other senior HUD staff, and it asks them to include $65 million for housing counseling assistance when they do their back and forth with Office of Management and Budget, who's responsible for writing the administration's budget. So hopefully folks have seen that. We've had a decent number of groups sign on already. We're going to keep pushing that out over the next few weeks, but this is the letter that we really try to get a ton of groups signed on. We try to have every state represented. So hopefully everybody on the call is either signed on or is in the process of getting whatever permission you need. But if there's any questions on that, please reach out to me, and you'll be hearing from me certainly in the next week and 2 weeks as we keep that going.
Good, and as always, that's highly valuable. We'll sort these by state so that local reps and senators can see which groups are supporting this. This actually will go to HUD, but we'll still keep the sorting in and make sure that the right people see this. And we'll, of course, do in the spring, early spring, our usual letter to Congress to push for a stronger commitment around HUD housing counseling funding. So stay tuned in 2019 for that. Okay. Well, with that quick note, we're going to move on and go to the opportunity at hand. And the idea here is that Senator Elizabeth Warren has introduced a substantial piece of housing legislation that really tackles some of the biggest issues in housing, both in rental and home ownership, that have been plaguing the market. And I mean, just to say, I think one of the things that we think is really valuable about this is just that it's an opportunity to really elevate an issue that has not gotten the recognition that it needs. That We know you know in your work how important housing is to the quality of life and for people's ability to have financial stability. And it has not been the kind of policy item that has been part of the debate in a way that we need it to be. And as a result, we've not been able to kind of do the kinds of big issues that we'd like to get addressed. And this ambitious bill is an opportunity to change that. So I'm going to ask Julia Gordon from the National Community Stabilization Trust to give us kind of an overview of the bill itself. Julia?
Thanks, Bruce. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit at a high level about the bill because this kind of wasn't originally my assignment, so I don't have a summary prepared.
And Julia, this is Rob. I'm on.
Oh, you're here. Okay.
All right. Yeah, sorry.
Rob, if you're here, do your piece.
Julia was
sure.
Pinch hitting here, so we have Rob Rondava from the Leadership.
Yeah, I got on a couple. Yeah.
And it's civil and human rights. Just let me do the
civil
quick intro here. So, and sure. The reason we have this panel is not only these are very smart people who are deeply involved in advocacy, but they've had, to varying degrees, input into legislation, and some of their ideas have been included. And Rob has had a leadership role in all this. So, Rob, please, why don't you give us an overview?
Sure. Okay. And actually, I actually got brought into a little bit later than some other folks that we in our coalition. So we came, we met with Warren's staff after most of the bill had already been drafted, but a lot of our member organizations, National Fair Housing Alliance, National Low Income Housing Coalition, National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and other groups had definitely been playing a role in various provisions. So this is a pretty comprehensive piece of legislation aimed at trying to continue progress against discrimination and trying to do trying to offer some solutions to the ongoing affordability crisis that we're facing. There are a few key provisions here. I'll run through really quickly. One is that it would ramp up in federal investments, the Housing Trust Fund, Capital Magnet Fund, and others to build an estimated 3 million new housing units aimed at lower income and middle class families, and that's rural. Another provision would call for down payment assistance programs in communities that had historically been subject to redlining, and in that provision, they have some requirement. They have some provisions that hopefully keep people from benefiting in neighborhoods that have already gentrified. That formerly redline neighborhoods that have already turned around and are already largely inhabited by higher income people. So there are income requirements in order to obtain the down payment assistance, and there are requirements for how long people have had to have lived there before the law was passed. There is support for underwater borrowers, including in suburban and rural communities. There's language to modernize the Community Reinvestment Act in order to cover more financial institutions and to encourage lenders to make more sustainable investments. It updates the Fair Housing Act to include sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, source of income, and veteran status. And then it also has provisions to encourage state and local governments to reduce zoning barriers that promote the development of affordable housing. And a lot of the funding provisions are paid for by rolling back some of the estate tax changes that were recently made so that the thresholds would be at the levels that were at the end of the Bush administration. And that's the basic overview. So it was introduced early last week, and there's some conversations going on now about finding a potential member on the House side to introduce it as well. And the idea is to just really get the conversation going about the affordability crisis and about the ongoing need to improve the Community Reinvestment Act. Which right now is especially important given the efforts at the comptroller to weaken the Community Reinvestment Act. So I'll stop there. And any questions?
Yeah, Rob, if you could just, going back to the funding provisions, you said we're targeted at the middle class. Do they define it by AMI, or do you know offhand how they define middle class?
I think in the down payment provisions, or which one?
I think it's in the down payment provision.
So in the down payment assistance program, there's an AMI. So there's a ceiling. There's an AMI ceiling. I think it's 120% of AMI for you to be eligible to receive the down payment assistance, and you have to have lived in a neighborhood for 4 years prior to the bill becoming law. And so that hopefully, I think that's the idea is so that people who more recently moved into a gentrifying area don't benefit from it.
Good. And
that you're really targeting more longer, people who have just been there for a long time, and in areas that haven't already gone through this explosive growth. It does not limit where people can purchase houses. It's just that if you had resided in one of these areas, so it doesn't say that you have to stay in that neighborhood. It's just the idea is that we want to promote people living where they want to live.
Which is a pretty sophisticated. There's a lot of sophisticated things here that they're really trying to address.
Yeah.
It's an ambitious, interesting thing.
Yeah.
And I would just add that when we're talking about these changes in the estate tax, what they're doing is they're restoring cuts that were made under the second Bush administration and or Congress, really. And we're talking about billions of dollars moving in these programs. So this is a serious commitment to affordable housing programs. Good. Well, there's a little bit of banging going on somebody's phone. Let's move on to Jason Richardson from the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Jason, help us understand the kind of the roots of the problem and how this bill addresses that.
Sure, and I think Jaron Levi is also on the line. She might want to actually lead this off.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. It's just that the two areas under Title II of Senator Warren's bill, which is aptly titled Reversing the Legacy of Housing Discrimination and Government Negligence, we really informed key provisions under that title of the bill, the down payment assistance provisions, which Rob just described, and it is 120% of area median income. And it's really the work that Jason's shop did here at NCRC around redlining and the HOLIC maps. So that informed that provision. So Jason, just go ahead.
Sure, thanks a lot. And Bruce, thanks a lot for having us on the call also. So my name is Jason Richardson. I'm Director of Research for NCRC. And this year we released a report at ncrc.org/HOLC. You can actually go there and take a look at it and look at the web tool that goes along with it. HOLC stands for the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And in the mid to late 1930s, this organization was charged with buying loans from banks during the Depression to allow those banks to start lending again. To help with that, they sent out inspectors to about 150 cities across the country, and they created a series of residential security maps. And these maps graded neighborhoods, and they sorted them into 4 different categories. the lowest of which was called a hazardous neighborhood, and it was indicated with red. The University of Richmond has done a lot of great work on digitizing a lot of these maps, and there are 114 of them that are currently in vector format that our GIS team was able to use and project over current census data. When we do that, we can see that today, 3/4 of neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s continue to be low and moderate income today. 64% of them are majority minority today. Now, in the 30s, redlining could be applied to a neighborhood for a variety of reasons. It could be because it was racially or ethnically diverse. It could be that there was industrial facilities in the neighborhood, or it could be the presence of any number of other religious or ethnic minorities that at the time were determined to be hazardous to the value of investments in that area. Today, those areas are overwhelmingly low and moderate income, and they're populated by African Americans and Hispanic families. So that's an 80-year pattern of kind of a persistent racial segregation that was not created by the HOLC, but they certainly documented it and institutionalized it. The FHA would come along slightly later and would then adopt the methods and the maps that had been developed by HOLC. And sometimes you'll hear the term HOLC. HOLC is sometimes referred to that way. That's what people are talking about when they say HOLC mapping. So today we've got a web tool up. This is at the website I mentioned, ncrc.org/HOLC. And you can look at any of those 114 cities where we have the maps digitized and compared with current census information, and take a look and see what it looks like for your community. So that it's been an interesting way to look at the persistent patterns of segregation that have persisted since that time. Thank you very much.
So, the Elizabeth Warren staff particularly cited the work of NCRC on this section and this project as being, one of the drivers here. One of the concepts that they're trying to address, which is difficult to address, is the pattern of racial discrimination in mortgage lending, that you're not allowed to lend by race, and the legal system is geared against that model. And the problem is that you have lots of programs that are designed to geographically address issues, but don't always doesn't mean that it really addresses the issue for people of color. And that's been a challenge, as we know, as we talked about in previous calls, and I'm sure people have seen in their work all the time, that the percentage of home ownership in African American and Latino communities especially, but in other communities of color as well, are below and or dramatically below where they are for the white community. And what this is part of this is using this concept of these maps to say that there's communities that were discriminated against, and if you're a resident of that community, you could get a 3.5% of the purchase price of your property could be done as a grant towards down payment, specifically to those areas, if you're a resident of those areas, to benefit them. And we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, during the call. But I think it's a complicated but ambitious attempt to try to right some pretty serious wrongs. And and hats off to NCRC folks for having created the tools that made this much more possible. So, and Jaron, did you want to say a word about the CRA portion? I know you all were pretty helpful there too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think at the outset, let me say that, as Rob referenced in the beginning, we're at the beginning of a real fight around the CRA and CRA enforcement right now. The bank regulator for some of the nation's largest banks, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, we call them the OCC, has put out a notice with some bad ideas around CRA, and public comments are due November 19th. We expect to see thousands of comments by banks seeking to weaken CRA, make it easier for banks to pass their CRA exams. Just so you know, today about 98% of banks already passed their CRA exams, and that's a pass rate that suggests a higher level of lending, investment in financial services in low and moderate income communities and underserved communities than actually exists. So we really need to counter the industry side narrative here. So we're really urging folks to comment before the November 19th deadline. And we have a sample letter on our website. I think Bruce has circulated it. It's at ncrc.org/treasure-CRA. And it really makes it very easy for you to plug in a comment and just click a few buttons. So please, I just would urge everyone to weigh into this conversation because it will really affect the home mortgage lending you see on the ground. So what Senator Warren's bill does is really present a better vision for modernizing CRA in ways that strengthen the law. And just a couple of top lines. I mean, essentially, it seeks to expand the law so that more lenders will be examined and more lending will be examined. So first of all, CRA only applies to banks right now. This would expand it to credit unions, financial technology companies or fintechs and mortgage companies, and some others. The bill would also examine more lending. So not only where banks have bank branches or an ATM network, but also where they're doing, lots of banks are doing a lot of online lending now. So wherever the provisions of the bill seek to capture wherever they're doing a significant amount of business outside of their branch network. Essentially, the majority of a bank or financial institutions lending and business activity. So we set that at 75%, but the goal is to capture a great majority of financial institutions' loans and other products. I'll just cover one last thing. So the head of the OCC, the comptroller, James Otting, was quoted in the Wall Street Journal this week as saying to one of the industry side groups that part of his plan is to make it harder for community groups to quote unquote pole vault in and hold bankers hostage when bank mergers and acquisition deals are up for regulatory approval. Because when banks seek to merge or acquire other banks, when they seek to grow bigger, and if they have a poor CRA rating, then that is the place where CRA really is the most effective. The regulators will look at a bank's rating at that time. They actually discourage banks from, they have had the practice of discouraging banks from merging or growing larger until they improve their community lending and investment. So whereas the OCC seeks to weaken community input at that point, the Warren bill seeks to enhance and improve and ensure that communities do have a role around how banks lend and invest in their communities. So there are some plussed up provisions around public input, public hearings, and the public's role under CRA.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. And we'll do more of a conversation about the current state of CRA in our call in 2 weeks. NCRC will participate in that as well. So more to come on that department. So
And
let's move over.
Jeroen, I think this is a question for you.
Okay.
How will lending institutions adhere to the proposed changes? And then they said, for example, 3 1/5% grant to offset value.
I didn't understand the last part of that. How will lending?
Sorry, I don't either. So maybe we'll ask that person to elaborate on what exactly they mean, and we'll come back to that, I think.
Yeah. I mean, just in short, the bank examiners go in and examine banks, and they grade them on how they lend and invest in their community. They actually get a CRA rating. So we are seeking to improve, the process. And I think it's fair to say that what the OCC has proposed would weaken that process.
Okay, good. So let's move on quickly to fair housing, and the National Fair Housing Alliance, I know, had a lot of input into this, helpful input onto the legislation. So we have Jorge Soto.
Hi, Bruce. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, you're coming.
Great. Thanks. Okay, sounds great. Thanks so much for having me on. Yes, so I'm happy to cover the fair housing piece of the bill. So, we're really excited about the fair housing pieces of the bill and several other pieces as well, and share a lot of the sentiments that folks on this call have made. For the National Fair Housing Alliance, our primary focus is essentially enforcing and implementing the Fair Housing Act on a federal level. And so, over this last several years, we've taken a look at the discrimination that exists against LGBTQ people and unmarried people, and then also just a long-standing issue that we've all been aware of with regard to discrimination against people who use housing vouchers and other forms of legitimate income that isn't being accounted for or considered in housing transactions. And so this bill really gets at the heart of those issues that we've observed and that many folks on the phone may have observed in their own communities working with individuals. So the bill prohibits discrimination. It adds to the existing protected classes under the Fair Housing Act, prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, and source of income. And those are protections that have been added. Those are protected classes that have been moved along, or that have been included in previous efforts to amend the Fair Housing Act. And so the language in there is very similar to what we've seen in the Housing Opportunities Made Equal Act from the last from 2 and 3 Congresses ago. And just a little bit about that form of discrimination. Several states actually prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, and source of income. But that does not mean that, the protections are really as strong as they could be, and that, federal resources and the strength of the federal government's enforcement structures, really aren't going to be there to support those existing local protections. And so, insofar that we can make sure that those protections are included in in all federal programs, but also in the private market, we definitely want to see those move forward. In terms of just a little bit in terms of marital status, that kind of gets at the heart of discrimination against unmarried people that can be used by conservative landlords landlords that ascribe to a specific belief system around marriage and family building, has been used against women who are single, has been used against all sorts of combinations of families that may not fit within the traditional mold that certain landlords might not. That certain landlords might not agree with. And so, this gets at that particular issue that we've observed in a number of different areas. And then in terms of source of income, that's a piece of the bill that we're really excited about because for such a long time, the use of a housing voucher was an exciting moment for families. It's an exciting moment for families to be able to access the housing voucher program. You spend time waiting on the list, waiting to get approval to become someone who can actually have a housing voucher. But many families, especially people of color and people with disabilities who use housing vouchers, are met with outright resistance by landlords who do not want to participate in the program. And this is often because of the stereotypes that they've associated and that have been associated with the use of public assistance over the last several decades. It can actually be discriminating against someone on the basis of their use of the housing voucher or some other form of public income support or service actually can be a proxy form of discrimination for it can serve as the same type of discrimination against people of color, women, families with kids, but through the use of discriminating against something that isn't federally protected. And so it serves as a way for landlords to legally be able to bar people who they might not want to have in a complex because they may be Latino or African American or someone with children under the age of 18. So that is an important piece of the Fair Housing Act that we think needs to be addressed and that we're excited about. And for folks on the phone who may be familiar with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, there is a source of income protection under ECOA where the use of public assistance it's discrimination against someone in a lending transaction because they use public assistance is explicitly prohibited. And so you can kind of think of source of income discrimination in with that framework in mind, but in rental transactions and sales and also in lending, as the Fair Housing Act would apply. The other piece of the bill that's really exciting is that it makes better use of the housing choice voucher by essentially freeing up different opportunities for public housing authorities to direct those resources internally. It also allows for tribal communities to create and administer their own voucher programs. We're really excited about those pieces as well. One of the major aspects of the bill that I think is going to be really important is, making sure that in the voucher program that public housing authorities can actually would actually be able to provide housing counseling. They would be able to provide mobility counseling services. So, what ways, what strategies a public housing authority can use to help voucher holders access new and different communities where there might be a better school, or that might be closer to important places that the family needs to be closer to, is something that we think is really important, and we're excited to see that. Beyond those added protections, when you add a protected class to a civil rights statute, there's also the need for education to make sure that the public knows that this is actually something that they can seek justice for if they do become the victim of discrimination because they are gay, or they are someone who is unmarried, or if they have a voucher. And so, along with these protections, we also need to make sure that should we actually get this kind of legislation passed, we need to make sure that education and outreach is done in a way that makes sure that people know they can actually come forward should they become the victim of discrimination of any of these types. I can stop there. There's probably more around the public housing piece, but I can maybe stop there and let folks ask questions.
Excellent.
No questions at the moment.
Okay. Good. Well, and let's keep rolling, and then we can always come back if we have time. So we have Linda June from the Americans for Financial Reform, and Linda, you were going to talk a little bit about this incentive system to eliminate land use restrictions, and also a little bit more on the money that's available for affordable housing.
Hi, thanks for having me. So basically, I think I would kind of put these two pieces together and say, one of the things that Senator Warren has really thought through is making sure that there's actually enough supply for people to either rent or buy. So one of the biggest problems with housing is the lack of affordable supply. And, while we see, I think in certain communities around the country, there's, maybe an increase in like luxury construction, and other places there's maybe not much increase in construction at all. But I think one of the things that is really a problem is just not enough development and not enough supply of affordable housing units for low and for moderate income Americans all across the country. And so this bill really attacks that problem in a couple ways. The first is there's a $10 billion competitive grant program. So this the whole point is to kind of have a carrot for communities to be motivated to ease their land use restrictions and zoning restrictions so that more affordable housing can be built. And so this is a grant program, so communities would have to apply, and then the grants would be given out, and that money can be used for, things that community needs, whether that's, parks or roads or schools, or so it's basically money that they can apply for to build the things that they need or do what they need to do. And in exchange, the one thing that they have to do is restrict their zoning restrictions, so more new affordable housing could be built in that community. The other piece that really goes to increasing the supply of affordable housing is just a ton of money that's put toward funds that really support this mission. So there's $450 billion that goes into the Housing Trust Fund. The Housing Trust Fund is really that money goes to housing authorities and it really supports affordable housing for extremely low and very low income households. That can include homeless families. So that's really addressing that specific population's needs, which is really important. There's another $25 billion that goes into the Capital Magnet Fund, and that money goes to CDFIs and nonprofit housing organizations, also to build new homes for lower income and middle class families. And then it creates a new fund called the Middle Class Housing Emergency Fund, which is more support for construction of homes, specifically in places where a supply shortage is identified, and another $2 billion for Indian Housing Block Grant to build or rehab houses on tribal land. So that's a lot of resources and a lot of money that's available to make sure that there's enough units, or at least a dent in addressing the issue. So one of the studies that was released with this bill is, it says that there should be, as a result of this bill, increases in up to 200,000 more units in 2019, 250,000 units in 2020. And if you look at maybe the next 10 years into the future, there should be about 300,000 more units each year if this bill plays out the way it's supposed to. So it's a big step in increasing our housing supply so people, that there's more houses for people to get to live in. And also, as a result of all of that growth in construction and development, it would also create as much as 730,000 jobs in the first year, and 1.5 million jobs at the peak of the impact in a few years. So that's the projected impact of all of these resources being put into affordable housing development.
And one of the other benefits is that by increasing supply, which is really a major part of the housing crisis in the United States, that it will tamp down and maybe even decrease the surge of rents and housing prices. So this is it is a fundamental problem of the housing market today, that there's not enough supply for the growing population. So very good, thank you. And so we have Julia Gordon, who's been on our calls before, and from the National Community Stabilization Trust. And I thought Julia could kind of wrap it all up. Obviously, there's a lot, but with somebody with a seasoned voice and experience about what your thoughts are about this legislation and how we might think about it.
Sure. Well, I'm going to focus, because who's on this call, on the ramifications for the housing counseling community. I think what you've heard from the previous speakers is that this is an extremely ambitious bill, by far the most ambitious bill to cover the housing waterfront in many years. The competition was not stiff due to a complete lack of bills on housing. So really what is happening here is just there's so much pent-up need for the legislature to address what is one of the biggest pain points for American families, whether they're renters or homeowners. It's just the cost of housing, and the fact that since shelter is a basic human need, folks have to spend whatever they have to spend to be in housing, and that takes away from other important spending, whether ranging from healthcare to education and just to general consumer spending. So in thinking about what this means for the housing counseling community, I went through the bill to try to think about homeownership. And what's interesting when you go through this bill is that there's quite a lot of focus on homeownership, which is welcome given that the concept of homeownership has been politically toxic since the crisis. But the specific allocations of funding are in the homeownership area are pretty fuzzy and general, and it's not really clear what would end up in homeownership. So I'm going to talk about a few different things. First, the amounts of money that go to the Housing Trust Fund and Capital Magnet Fund and the other pre-existing funds that this bill directs more resources toward, those are by and large not homeownership related funds. There are some projects that receive funding through the Capital Magnet Fund that focus on single family homeownership. The Housing Trust Fund has just a very, very small, tiny component of it that is oriented toward homeownership. But by and large, those programs have supported the desperately needed rental housing for very low income and extremely low income people. The Middle Class Emergency Fund that the bill creates is one of the sections of the bill that I would really call a placeholder. The part of this bill that's built out and quite detailed, no doubt due to NCRC's work on it and NAFA's work, are the parts that relate to the CRA work that you heard about and the discrimination issues that you heard about. The other parts of this bill are there to message around the needs in these areas, but the actual mechanisms are pretty vague. So the Middle Class Emergency Fund is split between rental and housing. It is not clear how it's split or what it really means to have a shortage of homeownership units, because at any given time you can identify how many families are spending, are in a housing situation that is unaffordable, but there's not an existing public policy mechanism to kind of say which of them should be a homeowner. So if a bill like this were to pass, most of this would be built out in the regulatory process. It is quite clear to me that if you're building out homeownership through the regulatory process, that you would be building in a housing counseling piece, because with any program like this, you're going to need to ensure that the money is being spent in a appropriate way and that recipients taking advantage of it are educated about what's happening. I would say the same thing about the down payment assistance program that's aimed specifically at the formerly redlined geographies. Down payment assistance is, I think dealing with down payment assistance and understanding how to counsel people around that and how to get them into the right loan and get the right amount of down payment assistance and make sure you have the right amount of equity in the deal as a whole, that's really the bread and butter of pre-purchase counselors. And it seems to me that if I were the regulator trying to implement a program like this, again, it's just in broad strokes in the legislation, I would be building in a housing counseling piece starting with pre-purchase and then extending through the life of the loan. Again, in another part of this bill that is more of a placeholder part of the bill, the section relating to negative equity, in that section, there's a specific mention of making sure that people in a negative equity situation have access to appropriate modification and refinancing programs. Again, those people who find themselves in those situations are going to benefit from counseling. And if I were writing the regs, I would be pushing for counseling to be part of that program. The CRA aspect of this bill would have a significant effect on the lenders operating in the mortgage space. With luck, it would encourage or, really require more lending in low-income communities and to low-income people. It's a little bit harder there to see, that's just more about the kind of lending mechanisms. And so there, I'd say the relationship to housing counseling is, as it is for any other CRA lending program. When you're doing CRA eligible mortgages, those are the borrowers for whom you would often be seeking to ensure there was housing counseling support in the process. So, Bruce, I'll stop there, but answer any other questions you want me to answer.
Good. We'll flip it over to Matthew. What have we got?
Not really any questions specifically on what you said, Julia. Just someone earlier had kind of reiterated a lot of the points that you made about the need to build counseling into a lot of the programs that have come up. That's all for questions and comments for the moment.
Okay, good. So what are the thoughts of our distinguished panel here on what the role of housing counselors can play in the process of this legislation now that it's been proposed, but needs to have political support behind it?
I'll jump in if nobody else is. So I think this has been said by others on this call. This is not a bill we're going to pass this session. So there's a set of activities you engage in with a bill that you're going to pass, and then a set of activities you're going to engage in with a bill that you're not going to pass. And we're in the second bucket here. It is absolutely critical for folks to speak out in support of this kind of investment in affordable housing, because what we're doing here is we're setting an agenda for the future with the hope that the future looks better than today. And I think it's especially important to provide love and reinforcement for any politician who is willing to jump back into the homeownership pool, so to speak.
And I think I would just underline that as well. I mean, I think we have seen the ability of housing counseling groups to be effective advocates for housing issues in Congress by working directly with their local House and Senate people, and we doing those things that elevate a large, ambitious solution to the housing crisis is it's a crisis. That's really valuable, and that's a role that I think the groups can play. And I guess there's a second issue which you're talking about, which is also that sort of how do you get this into the mainstream of public debate? How do you get how does this message in the world today when there's a crowded agenda of what the topics are? So anybody have any thoughts about what role the housing counseling groups could play on that part? joining in on something else or something that others are thinking about?
I mean, I don't think this is a necessarily a very creative idea, but it is is probably the most important thing that counselors bring to the table and should continue to do, which is telling the stories of those you're serving, right? Both in how as a counselor, you've helped someone with that pre-purchase counseling so they actually understood what they were getting themselves into, how housing, the stories of people who've struggled and those and the type of help that you've been able to give them and the type of help that they need and the resources you need to make sure that people get that help. As someone who comes from direct services not that long ago, I think for people working on policy, that there's never enough stories, I think, to really share the impact of what's going on with housing right now. And it's those stories that motivate people to keep talking about it and to take action and to brainstorm what actions are possible. So keep sharing your stories and keep talking about it, I think would be my 2 cents there.
Well, yeah, and doing those things that humanize the story, that means that it's good to have photographs, or it's good to have videos. It's good to see families that are that their lives have been changed by this. And I know we did an event in Tampa, and the family just talked about their first night in the house, and they didn't have furniture, and they slept on the floor. And then every year, the family on that anniversary date would go and sleep on the floor with the kids to just celebrate the fact that they were homeowners. And it's things like that people remember, that resonate deeply. And we should probably figure out what an appropriate repository is, but trying to get more of those as part of the narrative of what's really happening, how life-changing homeownership is, and how that matters so deeply to families. And it's just not just an economic issue. It has to do with security. It has to do with pride. It has to do with being part of the community. It's a part of a place where your kids can feel safe. Those kinds of issues matter, and we need to elevate them. And you all are the ones who actually engage with the people where those stories can be told. We're actually almost out of time here. So are there any quick closing thoughts that we should have? We'll obviously have a discussion about this continuously through going into the next year, but we're definitely very, very interested in playing a role as a community to be helpful on this, to be contributors, to help sharpen the specifics on the legislation, but also to be supporters and to help move the agenda forward. I mean, the idea, there's a lot of programs out there that are with ideas that are very much on the margins. And what's exciting about this is that we're talking about investment of billions of dollars. It's about expanding the kind of regulatory world that could benefit people. It's those kind of big solutions that are really what we need to do to get this back on course. So very helpful. Do others have any quick thoughts they want to give, or we're going to need to close out here, I think. So thank you, everybody, so much. This has been a terrific conversation. We'll post this on our website in the media library, and I bet that others will be interested in hearing this as well outside of our community, and we'll probably circulate that as information as well. But thanks so much for all your good work to the panel, and we're going to quickly rotate to quickly talking about NHRC membership. And just wanted to remind people that we actually are doing very well this year, and we really appreciate the heavy level of membership. And we've gone from an organization that had just over 100 organizations that were members to over 150 this year. We've really grown substantially, and we should actually remember to post all the new members on a few slides on one of the webinars we do soon. But it's been very helpful. I mean, I know that groups have appreciated the discount on the on credit reports, and and we're glad to do that. And we're interested in thinking about some other kinds of discounts that might be available. But the real reason to join is so that you can be part of the advocacy work, keep us independent, and allow us to pay for the lobbying that we do in Congress and in with other institutions as well. And this is kind of what makes us who we are. And it's been a strong display of support from the housing counseling community that shows that we've been successful. So please, there's you can always go to our website and link to the membership page, or you could just email me, and I would be glad to send you an application. I really like to get those kind of emails. You know, it's just I can't tell you how close we feel with the membership and the support when we get it. And certainly, if you're not a member yet, join, and your organization joins, and we'll send you the information on how to get the credit report discount along with other things that we do. Good. Well, with that note, I think we are in good shape to end the call. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We have two guests, which one of whom is Ross Gavinich. I hope I'm saying his name properly, and out of Texas. And he has his organization has a new, or not a new, a long-established client management system. It comes with a lot more different features than what other CMSs have had in the past. And it's been a lot of CDFIs use this, but some housing counseling agencies as well. And people have been encouraging us to highlight this, so you'll have a chance to look at that. And we'll also spend more time on the latest fight around the Community Reinvestment Act, and we'll have folks from NCRC as well as some other players in the field to talk a little bit about where things are at on that and what we can do to be helpful there. And then with that note, thank you, everybody. We'll talk with you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Bruce.